The information of everybody that might be interested. Votes ended just a few moments ago, and I suspect our colleagues will be drifting in as they complete it. Also on the floor, probably right now, are some commemorations and condolences for the lady who had my seat, Ellen Tauscher. And so we all mourn her loss. Let's see here. So, today's witnesses oversee a diverse set of programs that are all of great interest to this committee, including privatized military family housing, military construction, installation resiliency, disaster recovery, environmental programs, and planning for climate change. Our installations are the backbone of the services and are critical for readiness. They are the place where we train the force, maintain weapons and equipment, and the platform from which we project power. Our installations support our military families and provide a safe place for our forces when they come back after deployment, so that they can recover personally and reconstitute as a unit. In addition, the force evolves. As the force evolves, our installations increasingly house critical missions that are conducted entirely from home installations. One issue our subcommittee has been following for the past few months is the poorly managed privatized military housing program. If the services hope to recruit and retain the best candidates, they must ensure that they provide high-quality places for our service members and families to live. When barracks and dormitories fall into disrepair and create substantial living spaces for service members, it directly contributes to poor retention. Likewise, when the services fail to take care of military families, retention also suffers. This committee will continue to demand that the services and the Department of Defense improve their oversight of privatized military family housing until this committee is satisfied that all of our military families live in high-quality homes free from hazards to their health and their safety, and that they are treated with respect and dignity by the private partners and military housing offices. We will not step back. We will continue to keep a close watch over the privatized housing programs and hold both the military and the private companies accountable. Despite their importance, installations have all too often been neglected as funding has gone to other priorities. This year's budget requests $13.9 billion for military construction. This number does not include the additional $7.2 billion in funds that are said to be taken from military construction to build the border wall, and an additional $2 billion for disaster recovery. That $7.2 billion that the President wants for his border wall would go a very, very long ways towards getting the installations that have been ravaged by the hurricanes back up and running. And yet less than a third of the amount of money, that $7.2 billion, has been requested thus far for disaster recovery. That is a problem. The budget request includes $12 billion for facilities sustainment, restoration, and modernization. Last year, this committee was told that $116 billion of unfunded facility maintenance backlog, and that 32% of the department's facilities were in poor or failing conditions. I look forward to hearing what progress has been made in addressing that backlog in the intervening year and how this budget request will help address that challenge. The chronicle of underfunded facilities has diminished readiness in many, many ways. Deferral of routine periodic maintenance and building upgrades ultimately increases the life cycle cost of a facility. Further, in the last year, we learned that the old and under-maintained buildings failed during the hurricanes Michael and Florence. They failed at a much higher rate than the well-maintained newer buildings, and therefore added millions and millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, to the total disaster recovery cost. Maybe there's a lesson here about repairing your work and rebuilding your roofs on a regular basis. We have just begun to address the cost of recovering from these storms. During Mr. Lamborn and my recent trip to survey the damage at the Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point and Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, I learned that $1 billion is needed now to supplement the fiscal year 19 operations and the maintenance funds that were used to conduct immediate response and other near-term costs to keep these installations and their mission capable. And yet, instead of reprogramming funds for disaster recovery, this administration decided to reprogram $1 billion of unused Army personnel money to build a border fence. Question of choices and priorities is obvious to us. Do we rebuild our military bases so that they can function? Do we rebuild the main base for the Marine Corps on the East Coast? Or do we use our soldiers to put concertina wire along the southern border? A choice was made. In my view, a very, very bad choice. We're going to have to face the reality here that we're going to have to find money to replace critical money needed for infrastructure on these bases. So Camp Lejeune, Tyndall Air Force Base, and Offutt Air Force Bases are often discussed, but they are by no means the only installations impacted by increasingly frequent extreme weather-caused weather events that I believe are caused by climate change. It's essential for the Department of Defense to systematically plan for these extreme storms, for events that put these bases at risks from flooding and wildfires and droughts and earthquakes, whatever the risk happens to be at a specific installation. This committee will want to know what the military is doing to address that particular vulnerability and what is the approach to build resiliency into these bases. So we've got many things to look at here. We have department-wide, there are over 3,000 defense environmental restoration programs, otherwise known as cleaning up yesterday's mess. We find that all across the nation. We know that many members of this committee are concerned about these problems, particularly about the problems that have been caused by PFOAs, otherwise known as firefighting foam, that has contaminated drinking water and aquifers, not only on the installations, but sometimes on surrounding communities. So with that, we have our work cut out for us. My ranking member and good friend, Doug Lamborn, the microphone is yours. I yield to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this important hearing. I welcome our witnesses, all familiar faces except for one from our most recent hearing on military family housing programs. Though that hearing was less than a month ago, we would be glad to hear of any progress that the witnesses are able to share. Today we focus on all installation matters. While the broader installation portfolio hasn't achieved the notoriety of the housing program, it also needs improvement. Still, I am encouraged that all services have increased funding for facilities, sustainment, restoration, and modernization, FSRM, in this year's budget request. However, after years of underfunding FSRM accounts, we are faced with a considerable backlog of critical FSRM work, with almost a third of DoD facilities in poor or failing condition. I hope that the military services will be able to sustain higher funding in the out years. We also recognize that the Marine Corps and Air Force in particular are struggling to recover from the damage caused by Hurricanes Florence and Michael, as has been noted. The chairman and I toured Camp Lejeune and Cherry Point last month, and we saw firsthand the extent of the damage. We understand that neither service has programmed funding to address these challenges, and we are doing everything possible to provide the necessary disaster recovery funds. We also recognize the department is addressing contamination to groundwater caused by firefighting foam containing perfluorinated compounds. All of us want safe drinking water, of course. At the same time, we also expect that firefighters will be able to extinguish fires quickly and safely. I encourage the department to prioritize research into effective firefighting chemicals that are free from contaminants, and encourage you to continue working closely with the affected military communities to assure safe drinking water. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. We obviously share many of the same concerns. I think I was going to pass this to one of our committee members who has not yet arrived, but I do want to get on to the military housing and get on the record what the Department of Defense has done, and then drill down with each of the services as to where they are with it. And so, why don't we start with Mr. McMahon? If you could bring us up to date on the specific things that the department has done to deal with the military housing issue.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the question and the opportunity to be before you and the subcommittee on a variety of issues. Obviously, one that is important to you, to the ranking member and all of the members, is where we are with privatized housing. A reminder that that represents housing for only 30% of our military members. 70% are living out in the community. And as we have this conversation, it becomes tremendously important for us to underscore that not only do we need to think about this 30%, but we need to expand to include the 70% and ensure they're taken care of as well. Since last we spoke, sir, what I would tell you is we continue to focus on the same lines of effort that we discussed previously. First and foremost, what we want to do is ensure that there is a unified Bill of Rights that we clearly articulate to our family members and our military members what the expectations are when they come into a privatized housing. Where we are literally today, and we have a battle rhythm of meeting weekly to ensure we're taking the appropriate actions as an enterprise within the department to do the things that we need to do. We have a draft of that Bill of Rights that we have shared with the Congress. We have gotten input from our privatized partners. We have gotten inputs from our MSOs and VSOs, those organizations that represent both our military members and our veterans organizations. And we hope in the next 10 to 14 days of being able to share that draft Bill of Rights with our military families, utilizing a tool that we would push out to them, get their specific feedback to ensure that we've not missed anything, and then get that feedback back in and collectively so that we can move forward with have published Bill of Rights that clearly articulates where we are. So that's our 2-meter target. That's the thing we're most focused on. In addition, we continue to work with our privatized partners and within the services and the Office of Secretary of Defense to clearly define what a single common lease might look like to ensure that not only do we talk about these elements of the Bill of Rights, but also ensure that they're incorporated within the lease process that we have. In addition, we continue to look at how we best incentivize the proper behavior. That is through both the proper agreements with our privatized members, and we're doing that service by service, company by company. The other part of that is ensuring that we have adequate oversight. First of all, in terms of oversight, what I would tell you is that each of the services have re-energized the training and education that their military leaders get to ensure that they properly understand what those roles are. In addition, each of the services are looking at how they reinvigorate their housing offices to ensure that at the end of the day that we're providing oversight there, and as part of that, ensuring that we have an advocate for our military families on the installation whose sole purpose is to represent what their needs and answer their questions and feel like they have a voice in this process. It is easy for our senior members to feel comfortable with this as they've lived there for many years. For a young Marine or soldier who's 22 or 23 years old with a 19-year-old spouse, much less so. We've got to make sure that this gets to them as much as it does to anyone else. Let me stop there, sir, and see if that generated any questions or if my partners want to add anything at this point.
Let's go to your partners and see if they want to add anything to that, and then there may be some questions that the committee would like to ask on this issue.
Sir, on behalf of the Army, certainly Mr. McMahon covered a lot of the points that certainly the Army is following up on and engaged. Just to add a few specifics, we are scheduled to add 114 additional hires in our installation housing. So far, we've hired 81 of those and hope to hire the remainder by the end of this month. We have an Inspector General assessment that's been going on to look at all sorts of issues across the privatized housing aspects of the Army, including trying to ferret out any reports of reprisals. And that report will be completed the middle of May. And obviously, the Army senior leadership will be getting that report and the recommendations and making steps to follow up with that regard. We know that on the Army installations, the privatized housing partners have also agreed to hire additional staff in their housing portions to be more responsive. The figure I've seen is several hundred, and they've hired a good chunk of that. We pulled back any consideration of the quarterly incentive fees to the headquarters, where we are reviewing the progress that's being made, and we're not going to, make any decision on the incentive fees until we have thorough review of how the privatized partners have been doing, being responsive, for instance, to work orders. In that regard, working closely with the private companies, the companies have launched with their review and oversight web-based portals to allow residents to submit work orders in the most expeditious fashion, and then to track the progress all the way through, similar to like a Uber type of situation, concluding with, once the work order is completed, the opportunity of a 30-second or 1-minute survey, whether they receive satisfaction or not, and additional comments. This information is available to all levels, all the participants, meaning the residents, obviously the companies, the garrison commanders, and the Army headquarters. So it'll be a very effective measure of performance and strong accountability. We also have emphasized that the chain of command is the supporting mechanism, one of the supporting mechanisms that the soldiers and their families should turn to in case they are having any kind of difficulty. And this has been conveyed to the residents and emphasized to the garrison commanders to make sure that they carry the message up and down, literally, the chain of command. We have worked with our partners to create better metrics for, once again, overarching accountability. We have put forward an operational environmental health registry with our hope and our effort that will allow those residents who feel that they are having environment or health-related issues to be able to call into this registry and lodge their complaints so that our health service can keep track, build a database, provide advice on how to proceed in this regard, and more to come on that as that is further developed. We also are seriously considering a variety of advocacy for the residents, one that's already been in place and very effective out in our Army facility in Monterey, is what we call a mayority or mayor, somebody who is selected from the the residents, in other words, is a resident, to help residents to be an effective advocate for them. And in the surveys that we have seen, that has worked extremely well. And so therefore, we're seriously considering doing that across all the 49 installations. With that, I will stop and let my service colleagues talk.
Mr. Mellon?
Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the Department of the Navy, I'm going to compliment what Mr. Beeler and Mr. McMahon have talked about. As Mr. McMahon started this off, we meet weekly, and part of the benefit of that, I think, is sharing lessons learned and being able to accelerate off of each other's initiatives as they move forward. So you may hear slightly different terminology, but they're often underpinned in exactly the same kinds of initiatives. So along those lines, the Department of the Navy has actually expanded the scope of what we're looking at and gone beyond PBV housing. We're doing all housing for military and service members. And so for PPV for Navy, they're 100% done with contact. The Marine Corps isn't tracking it exactly the same because they're tracking for all housing. They're over 99% for contact. On the Navy side, they are 100% complete with their in-home visits. The Marine Corps has already completed over 7,400 in-home visits for all types of housing. So well on our way to getting a good hands-on understanding of where the residents are, where the issues are, and being able to correlate those into actions as we interact with our partners. One of the biggest feedback mechanisms we're getting are the biggest issue is the quality of the repairs they're doing. Sometimes it's a short-term repair, but the amount of time span before they come back to execute that permanent repair is excessive. There's been confusion about whether it's a short-term repair or that is the long-term repair. So in an effort to try and get better clarity on that, we've also got weekly metrics that are provided to the base commanders from the partners related to all of the open issues from their residents, what the status of that resolution is, and all of that data and information, just as Mr. Beeler just said, is available to those residents. Our partners are at various stages of having electronic access to that data and information for the residents, whether it's through an app or some other means. They're at different points of implementation, but they're all working towards that same end. As well, we've, through our medical community, established a registry and a hotline that we're currently in process of staffing that gives all the residents a direct number and a direct ability to lodge specific health issues. But we've also built it such that it links back with any health records for those families or service members. So we've got a closed loop system so we don't miss something by having something in two different mechanisms. Lastly, we've got two things associated with housing and housing personnel. We're working to try and free up as many resources as we can from a personnel perspective to add to base housing, to augment that. We've added our requirement to the unfunded priority list for both Navy and Marine Corps in 20. And then the last piece, we've got a full naval audit in process that's due to wrap up towards the end of May. So I would suspect end of May, beginning of June to have the initial results back from the audit, predominantly focused on work orders processing, and the business approach for how all that's incentivized and do we need to do some things from that perspective. And with that, I'll turn it over to the Air Force.
Thank you. Mr. Henderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'll espouse the comments of my service colleagues here, since we're working together on a lot of these things as the services and with our project owners, since we share a lot of the same project owners also. And that's essentially to provide in those areas where we should provide a consistent service to our residents. I'll just highlight a couple things that the Air Force is doing differently. First of all, in addition to what has just been mentioned, we're also doing an audit for our resident energy conservation program to ensure that the billing and the metering is being done correctly there. We had a few indicators that we have some anomalies there, so we're going to go back and just check and make sure that we're in good stead there. We've also, since the last time we talked, we've completed our Inspector General assessment. Most of those findings were internal to the Air Force and how we internally do business and pass information through the chain of command and are linked in with housing, and we're implementing those findings now. We have taken the time to back brief the professional staff members of the committees on that. Additionally, we're still continuing to work along 5 lines of effort through 25 objectives and literally hundreds of tasks now that we've incorporated those IG findings in there. We've completed 3,100 fixes of the 4,700 deficiencies we found during our commanders' walkthroughs. And we're in the process of linking in our medical community to ensure that any health issues that are addressed in our housing, any housing or any of our facilities, if it's linked to the facility in any way, that the medical community's linked into that. And then finally, I would just mention that we're getting after the personnel piece of this also. We have the unfunded request in to ensure that we can, for FY20, to fund advocates and augmented personnel and manning in our housing management offices.
Mr. Chairman, I neglected in one item, if I could,
Go
to
ahead.
add to this conversation, which I think is worthy of mention, and that is one of the gaps that we saw early on in this relationship is a lack of understanding in some cases of where our medical providers ought to go and how they ought to engage if a family came and said, I believe my child may have been exposed to lead, as an example. And so we have created an integrated product team between my staff and the Department of Defense health providers to ensure that we can re-educate and have clearly articulated to our health providers what it is that they ought to do, where they ought to engage, if in fact this type of issue is identified, to make sure that no one falls through the cracks or even perceives to have fallen through the cracks. Thank you, sir, for allowing me to add that.
Thank you. As I promised in our previous hearings, we're going to keep coming back to this. I am pleased that you're making progress on all of the issues. I didn't hear you mention 2 that were on our mind here. One is the lease that is signed by the family and the appropriateness of that lease, at least compared to various state laws and city and county laws with regard to tenant leases. I don't want to go into it here, but I want to make sure that that is under review. And finally, the contract itself between the Department of Defense and the various private providers. I understand those contracts have been requested, that they're under review by the legal teams within the department. We'll want to make sure that they are a well-balanced contract going forward. And with that, I'm going to ask if... yes, Mr. Lamborn, I know you have some comments on this, so please...
Well, thank you. Before we go on to other questions and issues, just a clarification on the housing issue. Mr. Mellon, I think I heard you say that the Navy is conducting 7,400 housing visits, and you are working on the results of that, or is that a work in progress, or do you have those results?
No, sir. So as a result of the contacts, so the 100% contact, as part of that, service members were offered to have the command and the PPV provider visit their house to actually look at whatever the condition or issue was. Of the people that we contacted, 7,400-ish requested visits.
Okay.
And that's all I'm saying is those visits have been accomplished. The issues are documented and currently being rectified and remediated in terms of whatever the issue was. I was just trying to say that for those that have asked for visits from the command, those command visits are actually occurring.
Okay, do you have metrics, quantifiable results that you can provide this committee
Yes,
on
sir.
how?
I can take that. I don't have that data right in front of me, but I'll take that.
We would love to see that.
Yes, sir.
And then for the Air Force, Mr. Henderson, you said 3,100 out of 4,700 work orders have been addressed. Did I hear that correctly?
That's correct. No, those were the work orders that were generated from our commanders' visits. We're following up on each one of those. We're micromanaging that, so to speak. The other 1,300 that are left, or so I think it's about 1,300 that are left, those are either material issues. We have a plan for them, but if it has to do with replacing a roof or something that's more of a long-term item, we're keeping those on the tracking mechanism.
Okay, and if you could give us a more defined report on the status of that as you wrap that up, we would sure appreciate that also.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That's all I had at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. I'm going to do something a little different here than the normal order of business. I know that there's a lot of concern among the members of the committee about this particular issue. And so since we're on it, let's stay on it. And so I'm going to ask each of the members if they have a single question that they'd like to put forth. It can be a long question. And let's see if we can get this issue out there. Oh, yes. Does anybody need their credit card squared away? Could you turn that thing off? You know, Mr. Lambo, if we don't do anything else, we've got to do something about all these sales calls that we get. You have a bill, thank God you got a bill. Leave it to the freshmen to solve a problem. So let's stay on this housing, offering all the members. We'll start, I see we have one on our side. I'm going to go down by the seniority around, and if you have a question, let's get it out there, and or if you have an issue and you want to put it on the table, now's your chance to do it.
And then after that, we'll address other issues.
Yeah, I'll go back and forth. I do want to get to the other issues. There's a whole host of them. We'll start here, and then I'll go back and forth by order of seniority. Okay? Austin.
Mr. Chairman, you've already brought this up. I again want to just bring forward the language in the lease. It is not a square deal for our military families to suggest that they should pay the legal fees of a huge corporation if arbitration or mediation does not go in favor of the military family, and that is a key issue for me in making sure that we resolve that. So if it's a square deal and a fair fight, if you will, for our military families.
Congressman Scott, we acknowledge that we concur, and part of this is to get to a position that we won't have to go to mediation, and that if we do so, we can do it in a way that does not drive a cost to the member.
Okay, Ms. Escobar? Oh, Ms. Horn.
I just want to echo my colleague from Alabama's sentiments about that. And Georgia, God, sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay, now I'm never going to live that down. I'll come visit in Georgia. Good bipartisanship, right? Georgia, I apologize. So now I'm gonna, so a couple of things. When I was back over the course of the recess period, we met with some of the families and the concerns about not only the lease provisions, but also what was going to be available to them, the remedies in the Tenants' Bill of Rights, and I think that lease provision and the provisions in there. I'd like to hear what top line provisions that you're working on to ensure that the individuals that our military members, our service members, are being protected, as well as the follow up, which I think you've already addressed.
Congresswoman, if I could go to our draft Bill of Rights, and rather than articulate, I would simply read what I think is getting at the heart of the matter of where we are in the draft right now. And that's right now, as it states, resolution in favor of the resident may include a reduction in rent or an amount to be reimbursed or credited to the resident. And that is to ensure that, as in any situation where you are improperly treated, that there is some sort of remediation to you financially that you can show that we are looking to you, that we've given you something for the pain that you've endured. Ma'am, does that get to your question?
I think it does. I just wanted to get the top line, but I think I met with a number of families that are still experiencing discomfort about the way that everything is progressing, and I think that this will help, but also the provisions in the lease. I'd be happy to talk to you about that more, but I think the protections, putting those in place, and also hearing from the base commanders about the need, and I know this is something we'll be addressing, for sufficient personnel to do the oversight of these companies.
And I think we all feel very strongly that we want to be able to get the draft Bill of Rights out to our military families who are living on base, so they understand exactly what we're attempting to do, and they have the opportunity to comment on that. And that's important to all of us, and the goal is to do that sooner rather than later.
Keeping in mind that we have many, many other things to go for it, I want to give each member an opportunity to ask a question, be as quick as you can. Mr. Brooks, you're up next. Pass. Ms. Escobar. On this subject or housing? Okay, no. We can stay on housing here. Down the line. It looks like Ms. Holland. Crow? Oh, sorry, Ms. Holland. Mr. Crow has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know with housing issues and dealing with contractors, sometimes one of the most difficult things is actually just taking time off of work to meet people for inspections, to meet contractors. You know, my wife and I both work, and that's a very hard thing, coordinating our schedule sometimes. So what are you doing to ensure that the service member is being given proper time off of his or her duties to make sure they are present during the commander's inspections, that they're able to meet contractors and support his or her spouse during these visits?
I'll go ahead and I'll start from a Navy perspective. All of the visits right now are at the timetable and schedule of the resident. So whether it's a home inspection, whether it's a move-in inspection, whether it's a maintenance event that needs to occur, regardless of whatever that is, it's being driven by the resident. From a getting off of not having to report for duty and those kinds of activities, that's being coordinated with their command structure to ensure that the appropriate actions are being taken and that they're being given the appropriate.
I guess my question, I'll just push back a little bit on that. I guess my question is a little bit different. I understand coordination with the command structure, but I think we all could agree that in practice that's hard, right? And so does that include, at the convenience of the resident, does that include evening and weekend times? Are we opening up kind of off-duty hours, evening and weekend times, to make that available so it's at the convenience of the residents?
Again, I think it varies, I would say right now, between our partners, PPV partners, and whatever constructs they have with their contractors that perform those maintenance functions. I would say from a management and leadership perspective, I absolutely believe we're accommodating evening and weekend visits, both from a command structure and from a partnership perspective. I think the remediation of specific maintenance events may be an issue by issue, and it may have a lot to do with whatever that subcontractor's agreement is with that partnership. Those are all some of the things we're looking at as we're revisiting both the agreements between the government and the partnership, as well as the standard lease that's in work across the department.
And from the Army standpoint, I think it's pretty much the same. I would only add that having this web-based portal app really is helping as far as scheduling times that are appropriate and convenient for the residents.
I would just submit, and then I'll allow others to move on here, but I would like to see a public display of priority by the command structure. So working with your respective service chiefs, maybe that takes the form of a letter or a directive or otherwise, to garrison commanders and to unit commanders, very clearly saying this is a priority of the service and that commanders should make every effort they can to ensure that their service members under their command can take the time available to meet this need.
Congressman, let me take that for the record and take it, and I owe you some feedback. We collectively would move forward in being able to implement. I understand the intent of what you're getting to. We can partner with our private partners, but let us get back to you and tell you how we attack it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Crow, if I might just add here, this problem can only be solved if the installation commander is held accountable. Ms. Holland, it's your turn if you have a question.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for being here today. Assistant Secretary Henderson, I understand that the Air Force has submitted $31 million unfunded requirement to add 250 personnel to its housing management offices. While I'm pleased that the Air Force is taking steps to ensure appropriate staffing to meet the needs of our military families, I'm disappointed that it's coming as a UFR, especially given the well-documented need for these personnel to help address the issues that we've all been talking about, the substandard conditions of military housing. Are there any other UFRs regarding military housing? And can you explain why it wasn't included in the President's budget request when so many other things were, like money for a wall, for example?
It's, ma'am, that there's no other UFRs. That was the only one we submitted with regard to housing. And then just some background on it. We kind of know what we needed in the housing offices because it was just 4 or 5 years ago during sequestration when we were forced into some pretty deep personnel cuts that we pulled those folks out of the housing management offices. They did that the Air Force did that as a calculated risk on the auspices that the project owners could take over some of those responsibilities for oversight and overseeing their maintenance, a bigger role in quality assurance, and the agreements allowed us to do that. And I think upon reflection and going around and taking a look at that, those cuts were ill-advised, so we decided to essentially restore personnel that we always had in those offices, and we kind of knew how many that would take to get back to where we were. So, no other UFERs, and then the history of that was, it was one of the cuts we took during sequestration that we're restoring now.
So in the future, you will fight to make sure that that is put in the actual budget and not necessarily an unfunded requirement.
Absolutely. We're actually changing the permanent organization structure to make that a permanent part of the CE squadrons there so that those become permanent positions in the Air Force.
Thank you, and I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Holland. A couple of things. Mr. Lamborn and I both immediately jumped into the housing. I jumped into the housing, and he joined me in jumping into the housing. We went right past the opening statements. I don't really want to go back to those opening statements. I do want to seek unanimous consent that the opening statements be put into the record. And then we'll move forward with the issues. I would urge each of the committee members to quickly thumb through, find your favorite issue, because you're about to be asked for your 5-minute opportunity for questions. I'm going to start with Mr. Lamborn while I quickly thumb through.
Sure. Let me ask you first about, on the Air Force side, Mr. Henderson, if we can get the disaster relief funding that's so vital to restore Tyndall Air Force Base, will the Air Force be in a position to restore funds to the FSRM projects that were canceled or postponed earlier this year?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good. Okay, that's a nice, short, quick, good. And I like that. It's short.
That's our
And I like that. Okay, and then for all the witnesses, what are you doing to address the problem of PFOAs and PFOS in groundwater at installations? I know in my congressional district, the cities of Fountain, Security, and Widefield have great concerns about this. So any one of you that could address this, I would appreciate it.
Congressman, if I could start from the OSD level. First of all, this is an issue that has clear focus, starting with the acting secretary through the entire organization. Our focus has been where the Department of Defense has been culpable for causing water to be contaminated, and that's drinking water to be contaminated, that the department has responded, and I can tell you today that there is no one drinking contaminated water above the 70 parts per trillion where the Department of Defense had been the causal factor for that water. Once that mitigation has taken place, and there's a variety of different ways that we have done that, then we follow the standard process outlined in statute and by the Environmental Protection Agency, the CERCLA process, to find a long-standing solution to ensure that we can mitigate the challenges that are out there. And so let me address up front one of the conversations. There has been tremendous discussion in the media about this idea that the Department of Defense was trying to drive to a different standard than what the EPA was asking for. I will tell you categorically that the Department of Defense has not been. We've been in discussions about process. We've been in discussions about how we best follow the guidance that the EPA has put out there and what that guidance looks like in terms of CERCLA and that how that would apply to groundwater, vice drinking water. But the Department of Defense strongly supports the 70 parts per trillion for drinking water and is doing whatever it can to ensure that where we are culpable for the impact on human beings, that we have mitigated that and we have a viable process for cleanup following CERCLA.
Although, isn't it true that EPA is still working on a final number?
Yes, sir. They are looking, the discussions that you've seen over the last probably week or so has been focused on a trigger for groundwater, vice drinking water. We've had some differing opinions on that. We fully support the fact that EPA has put that language out for public comment. We continue to work with the EPA on that, but the specificity of what has gotten the visibility of recent has been a discussion on groundwater levels, vice drinking water levels.
Okay, whoever else could address that, I would appreciate it.
Sir, from the standpoint of the Army, we have spent $20 million over the past several years monitoring and investigating to see where the presence of PFAS and PFOA is on all of our bases. We've come up with 13. We've taken remedies, as Mr. McMahon just said, to make sure that anybody concerned or affected is not drinking PFAS, PFOA water water containing 70 parts per trillion or more. We also are engaging in regular follow-up monitoring, and in those areas where we have found a problem, as Mr. McMahon said, we're following the circular process and taking appropriate remedial action as that process goes forward.
So from a Navy perspective, we've got about $10 million planned in the budget associated with AFFF. It's a primary cause for PFAS as it relates to fires and fire extinguishing. That's to look at both alternatives to that and look for those things that can be as robust in terms of their capability to extinguish a fire quickly. Standards for Navy are pretty high. It gets pretty tight on the ships. It's pretty dramatic consequences. So the speed at which it can extinguish a fire is a critical piece related to its capability. Along with that, we continue to look at different levels of mixture for the specific chemicals that generate that condition. And we're starting to roll those back in terms of percentage of mixture, so we're putting less out. Along with that are the operational concepts associated with how we're even using AFFF today. We only use it in the instance of real fires, where those fires and fire conditions require the use of AFFF. We don't use it in training. We don't use it in any other instances. And when we do use it in the case of a real fire, that site is then treated as a hazmat site and is cleaned up at that time as a result of that.
Thank you. And Mr. Henderson.
Yes, sir. Again, I'd like to espouse the comments of my service counterparts, but a couple key points for the Air Force and then a couple key points on nationally. First of all, this is more than just a Department of Defense problem. This is a national problem for which the Department of Defense has been leading forward on. And I would submit that to this committee that there is going to require a whole government approach from the interagency with assistance from Congress and administration to get after this. From an Air Force perspective, and specifically in Colorado Springs, where I know we've spent a lot of time addressing the issues in that area around Peterson Air Force Base. First of all, we've spent about $300 million on remediation of PFAS and PFOA over the last few years. In this year's budget, we've asked for $303 million for environmental restoration alone. That's a 7.5% increase. Like the other services, we use the circular process, which takes on average about 8 years to get through that process. So it's slower than we would all like, but it's also the mechanism and the tool that we can use, the authority that we can use to spend money for this. In the Air Force, we're using three lines of effort to do this. The first one is to protect human health, and this is the identify, respond, and prevent stuff that we do out at the bases every day to capture the extent of the problem, ensure that we understand the full extent of damages to the ecosystem, break the chain for any impacts to human health, and then put a long-term solution in to fix that. The second line of effort is to ensure that we're communicating transparently with the state and local regulatory authorities and the stakeholders and the restoration advisory boards. We found in the case, in the act of trying to do a right thing, if this communication link is broken, we still risk losing the trust of the local community we're in. So we see this as an absolute absolutely an important link. And then third is the work that we have to do here in DC to get to work on the whole of government approach, and that's working across the different services and with the Office of Secretary of Defense, along with the EPA, Department of Agriculture, Health and Human Services, on a lot of the other initiatives that we don't have the authority to do, but do require federal government assistance. And that's kind of where the Air Force is at on PFAS and PFOS, sir.
Okay, thank you all for your answers, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Let's move along here. I'm going to skip my questions, and I'll come back towards the end of it. The next, Ms. Escobar is up next. We'll pick her up when she comes back. Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join you, too, in expressing sympathy to the family of the late Congresswoman Ellen Tosher. She was a devoted member of this committee and just a fine person that we all had the opportunity to work with. So I want to extend my sympathy. Mr. McMahon, I'm grateful for the relationship between the U.S. and our European allies. In the Army Corps of Engineers, they're currently building a world-class military hospital, the Rhine Ordnance Barracks Army Medical Center near Kaiserslautern, Germany, which we're really grateful as the sister city of Columbia, South Carolina, that I have the opportunity to represent substantial portions of the community. How is the Department of Defense mitigating the use of Russian energy sources? Is there concern about adversaries using this to weaponize energy supplies?
Congressman, as you're aware, as you look at the National Defense Strategy, we voiced great concern about both Russia and China and its impact in a variety of ways, both militarily but also economically. Clearly, there is a concern about the reliance on our partners and our allies on fuel from Russia. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to drive what fuel a private entity outside the United States, where they source that fuel from. However, what we can do is ensure that for our installations, both in the United States as well as those overseas, is that we consider resilience of those installations and that we come up with solutions that say not only for example, climate or weather or cyber, but also for energy. How is it that we can come off the grid to ensure that those type of installations can continue?
And in line with that, Mr. McMahon, in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, there was a direction to the Department of Defense and Department of Energy to develop a pilot program for micro-reactors. The Defense Science Board Task Force issued a report recommending the logistics demand by the U.S. military be scaled down. Is a pilot program on track to power critical loads at a permanent domestic military installations by December 2027? What's the status of any prototypes?
Congressman, thank you very much for that question. There is a tremendous focus on that, not only within the department, but at the National Security Agency level or National Security Council level. I'm personally involved in that, and we have really a twofold way forward on that issue. The first is that we're looking in conjunction with our national labs of creating a capability to leverage whereby the commercial sector would develop the small modular reactor, be able to take that and put it at remote locations, for example, and then we would leverage that as a source of power for those installations. The other part is looking at the micro level as to how we could, on a much smaller vehicle, be able to create that capability. Our research and engineering folks are focused on that. The first effort, which is the one driven by the 2019 NDAA, we feel strongly that we'll be able to beat that 2027 date. In addition, the second effort, which is a smaller, perhaps vehicle-borne type that we could apply anywhere, we're in the midst right now, literally last week, of releasing a request for information for partnering with the private sector to see where we can go with this and what the art of the possible is, and we'll continue to keep you updated on both efforts as we move forward with it.
Well, that's terrific, and Congressman Garamendi and I both are keenly interested in modular and micro reactors. And Mr. Mellon, the department is still working on plans to relocate 5,000 Marines from Okinawa to Guam. What is the status of the construction activities to support the move to Anderson Air Force Base in Pearl Harbor? Do you anticipate both installations being capable of supporting the additional personnel and equipment?
So all of our construction projects associated with DPRI and the movement of the Marines from Okinawa to Guam and to Hawaii are on track. They're continuing to progress on schedule, and we anticipate them being ready to catch those Marines when they come ashore. Additionally, Japan has recently gotten their portion of their projects through their DIAC, so their budget is approved for this year. So the complement piece of that comes from the Japan contingent is also funded. So all of those projects are on track.
Congratulations. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks for being here, everyone. Mr. Henderson, you were in Michigan. I'm from Michigan. You were in Michigan, I think, last week or week or two ago, up at Oscoda Air Force Base, seeing and talking to residents. Can you just tell me your takeaways from the trip?
Yes, ma'am. You know, first of all, my takeaways is there's a lot of frustration on how slow this process is. There's extensive contamination up there, and it's taken a lot of time to get through the site inspection. And as we go through that iterative process, we learn more, and then we realize we have to take more tests and expand the site inspection. The good news is in 2015 we brought on a pump and treat facility there near I forget the name of the marsh there on the side, but since 2015 we've been able to remove about 90% of the PFAS and PFOA from that plume. Last August, we also opened up a second pump and treat facility as an interim measure under CERCLA, and this August we'll open up a third pump and treat facility as an interim measure under CERCLA. So while we're 4 years into the CERCLA process and we're just getting ready to move into the remedial investigation phase, there has been a lot done, and clearly there at Wordsmith there's a lot left to do.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you saw the press reporting from your trip on the Michigan side, but there was a lot of concern that you referenced the CERCLA process over and over again, which we understand is something that you live with. Is there any precedent for speeding up the process or anything that Congress can do to turn what feels like a decades-long answer to the residents who literally are scared to drink their water?
So first of all, I wish there was something we could all do to speed that up. Reference the drinking water. When we did all the drinking water tests, we found that nobody on the base was drinking any water with PFAS and PFOA. And when we checked all the bases off wells, we only found one off-base residential well, and we're providing alternate water for that. So while we're going through this process, there's nobody that's drinking contaminated water, at risk of drinking contaminated water. So as
but just to be clear, I'm sorry, my staff member is from literally her grandma ran the kitchens on that base. They're terrified to drink their water. Many of them are paying for their own water, like our residents in Flint are, and they can't sell their homes at a decent price. So they may not physically be drinking the water, but they're living in a situation where they feel they are because they don't have a clear answer and economically are paying the price for it.
Right, I understand their concern, and we share that concern. As far as speeding up the process, a lot of this kind of relies on how fast we can do the testing, how fast we can drill boreholes, how fast we can understand what the extent of the plume is. So some of this is just constrained by the laws of physics and how quickly we can fully understand the problem. While it takes some time to get it to figure that out and to identify the full extent of the problems, it's an important step for us so that we have the right solution in place. That the last thing that we'd want to do is spend 6 or 8 years going through the CERCLA process and identify a solution to only find out 20 years from now we got it wrong and we wasted tens of millions of dollars and not address the long-term solution for this. So
yeah.
CERCLA requires us to do that. But that's what takes most of the time. It's really the engineering and the environmental science that goes into that, and it's an unfortunate requirement. It's part of the profession to get it right.
Well, I do appreciate you coming and taking an hour's worth of questions from our residents. I was interested, Mr. McMahon, in your saying that it was an erroneous report in the media that the Department of Defense had pressured the EPA to lower the standards just this past week for cleaning up groundwater pollution caused by PFAS. My understanding is the proposed standards completely eliminate a section on responding to immediate threats posed by hazardous waste sites, and instead focuses entirely on long-term solutions. I'm glad to hear that's erroneous. Can I just have on record from all four of you that, did you recommend the lowering of standards and the exclusion of responding to immediate threats posed by hazardous waste sites? Can I just have you all on the record, please?
Congresswoman, what I will tell you categorically, we did not attempt, the Department of Defense did not try to lower the standard. What we articulated was following the circular process that has been alluded to and utilizing longstanding statutes and guidance that the EPA itself has released in terms of determining what levels of PFAS, PFOA should be in groundwater. And again, you have my assurance that we did not try to impact either the drinking water or anything but what was the standard process for groundwater.
On behalf of the Army, I've had absolutely no discussions with anybody regarding EPA regarding this issue, and I don't intend to.
From my perspective in the Department of the Navy, we have not pushed back or had any dialogue other than to understand the rationale behind the EPA's recommendation. We're firmly behind the scientific and logical approach laid out in the circular process, and it is ultimately the EPA's call in order to set what those standards are. Once those are done, the Department of the Navy is fully on board with remediation and understanding.
On behalf of the Air Force, we haven't had any discussions with the EPA on this topic.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Slotkin. Before we leave this contamination issue, Mr. Mellon, you said that presently the U.S. Navy does not use any of this material in training programs. There are two other services up there. Do you use this material in training programs?
On behalf of the Army, no, we do not.
On behalf of the Air Force, we stopped using it for training. We only use the foam now for incidents where we needed to put out a fire, and then we treat it like a hazardous waste and clean it up right away.
And Mr. Chairman, the other element that I would add to that, that Mr. Mellon referenced in treating areas as a special type of spill, if we've got that, all of the services are doing exactly the same thing.
Thank you. Mr. Kim, you're next.
Thank you for taking the time to come out here today. I wanted to ask about something that I've been learning more and more about as I've been focused in on the response to what happened in Tyndall Air Force Base. Something that came up over and over again was how just in the lead up to that and a couple months before, there were at least, I think, 2 hurricane exercises that took place there. And it seems like, from what I've heard, that played a really big role in saving lives. That the planning and the exercises were critically important. And this is something I think about a lot because the joint base in my district, McGuire-Dix-Lakehurst, after Superstorm Sandy, that base was up and running 24 hours after that storm and allowed it to be sort of the base of FEMA operations for responding to a big chunk of the Northeast. So I guess I wanted to hear from you, from each of you, about your respective installations. Just, what protocols are there to be able to make sure that there are these types of exercises and plannings, especially as we're just, about a month out from hurricane season starting up. I'm just interested in understanding, what protocols are put in place, which installations are required to do these types of exercises and trainings. Just to kind of make sure that we're all set as we're entering the hurricane season. So if you don't mind, I'd love to just hear briefly from each of you.
Sir, I'll start first. The Army is engaging in a variety of approaches at the installation level to counter emergencies of all type, and particularly unexpected emergency, whether they're weather, climate, cyber, whatever, natural causes, man-made causes. So some of the examples have been energy resilient exercise that the Army has done now, some of them with OSD funding, using Lincoln Labs, MIT experts to help in this, to lead in this exercise. It's been done at Fort Stewart, Fort Greely, Fort Knox, which actually used Army money to do it, and then most recently last week at Fort Bragg, where the entire facility was unplugged from the grid as if everything went down, which it really did do, and remained unplugged basically for 12 hours. And this was, will have more results, obviously, as they examine the consequences, but these have been excellent exercises. They cost roughly, depending on the size, and of course Fort Bragg's the largest military, the Army's installation. It's the equivalent of a city of 250,000 people. But these exercises run about $250,000 to $500,000. And just in my limited experience, I think they're worth every penny of it to get base commanders on up and on down prepared for unanticipated disasters, whether they're hurricanes or other aspects. On a broader, and so we will encourage, and we're already thinking of where the next major installation would be doing this exercise, and the Army is certainly willing to fund some of these going forward. The other thing, just quickly, we have installation management and water plans that we're requiring our major installations to put forth. We have 22 scheduled to be completed by the end of this fiscal year. And part of that whole exercise is to address the issue that you have raised. What will the installation do in an emergency situation? How will this affect the access to energy and water that would be so vital to keep that particular base resilient through the times of crisis? Finally, we're in a process in my office of putting forth a revised directive that will give the garrison commanders greater flexibility in setting the requirements for the given base on how much energy resilience there needs to be in place in case such an emergency or disaster occurs. And we hope to have that through the system very soon.
So what I'd add to Mr. Beeler's comments from a Department of the Navy perspective is, first, the kinds of drills and exercises and training you mentioned related to the people aspect of things like hurricanes and HUREXs, are, at least from a Department of the Navy perspective, I'm confident for the other services, are part of the normal command structure, normal command requirements to do them on a periodicity. It includes many things beyond that. It includes active shooter and all those aspects. So that is, I think, inculcated from a culture and command perspective. Beyond what Mr. Beeler said related to other attributes for plans at a base level, plans from a command perspective, we're starting to incorporate much more stringently resiliency from a design perspective, not just from individual MILCON projects or individual modernization projects, but from an infrastructure perspective. So the Marine Corps has recently put microgrid in place at Yuma, Arizona. So that's been up and running now for about a year, and we've got some results from that from last year in terms of things it mitigated in terms of power outages for that region. As part of the budget for this year, they've got plans to put 4 more microgrids in place on other bases. So those kinds of things, I think, add and help mitigate some of the impacts of climate-related activities and other issues.
Great,
that
thank
challenge the
you.
infrastructure.
Well, we're out of time here, so I'll yield back, but if there's anything else to add, if you don't mind submitting as a question for the record. Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Kim, I suspect Mr. Crow is going to pick up this issue, carry it forward, so perhaps there'll be an answer for you. Mr. Crow, it's your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, as the chairman indicated, an issue of Growing importance for me is this issue of energy resilience and the development of microgrids, as we've seen, with Fort Sill and others that lost some mission-critical tasks during some prolonged shortages. And as we have continued to look deeper into this issue, our vulnerabilities from cyber attack on the civilian infrastructure, as well as extreme weather events, are deeply and increasingly of concern to mine. So picking up on the topic of microgrids, I'd love to hear from the rest of you on the role that you think microgrids will play. What is being done to expedite the development of those grids, in particular on the wind and solar front? And what are the critical tasks you see in the next 1 to 2 years that need to be accomplished to expedite the development of those grids?
Go ahead. Congressman, I absolutely agree. Microgrids are critical. The Army has started. Obviously, there's always a long way to go. We have 156 installations to cover, of which I'd say certainly a significant portion are top priority installations as far as their mission is concerned. But we have several programs that we have launched through our Office of Energy Initiatives, and I will put the projects that they have put forward in these areas, all about energy resilience, many engaged in microgrids, distributed energy, and I will put for the record the summary of the projects, the location, their significance for the committee. We also have taken advantage of the Congress's funding of the ERSIP program that OSD administers the funding, and each of the services competes for it. And the 6 projects that the Army has been successful in getting funding that has for consideration of the latest $150 million total goes along with microgrids, distributed energy, battery support, combined heat and power, things that once again can place the Army in being resilient, and in times of emergency or not even just a regular course of business, can rely on these sources of power to make them more effective in case there are attacks in that regard. We have the great example of Schofield Barracks in Hawaii that is a multi-fuel project, public-private.
And Mr. Wheeler, sorry to interrupt you. I do want to give Mr. McMahon an opportunity to address the question as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
To achieve that goal, to get to where we need to be and accomplish that type of resilience in the area of energy.
Yeah, thank you. For the Air Force, we have 7 pilot projects going on right now to develop installation energy resiliency plans. We intend to franchise the best practices of that throughout the Air Force. That plan would include many types of resiliency projects, depending on the base, the geography, the physics there. It does include distributed energy sources, depending on what works there: wind, solar, natural gas, and so on. So certainly we do that. We prioritize our projects based on 5 attributes: robustness, recovery, response, resourcefulness, and redundancy. We call that the 5 R's, but essentially we're bringing that into our lexicon and using that for funding, for priorities, and to put these ERSIP projects online.
Mr. Millen, the biggest task in the next year for the Navy to address this issue?
I think the biggest task for the Navy is to make sure we've got a sound baseline to understand where our risks are installation by installation. In particular, when it comes to a lot of those installations along the coast. and what some of those MILCON and modernization projects will look like so that we accommodate those risks.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. As promised at our first hearing, this issue of energy resiliency and energy conservation will be a continuing theme that we'll be hitting upon. I do want to compliment you gentlemen and your staff for your reports that are now part of our record. Many of these issues are covered there. We'll come back and hit these all over again. Ms. Holland, you're next.
Thank you, Chairman. I first wanted to just say that the contamination issue has hit home in a big way in New Mexico, and it's a huge concern of mine. Cannon Air Force Base near the dairy farm near that is adjacent to the base. This man has just completely lost his business that he's worked all his life for. And so it is definitely an important issue for me, and we will likely be adding, asking more about that. But I did want to address some issues with respect to Indian tribes and American Indian affairs. And so I will just put out my question. If you can answer them, that's great. If you need to submit to the record, that would be fine also. And I'll start with you, Mr. McMahon. I understand the Department of Defense has requested $12,227,000 for the Native American Land Environmental Mitigation Program, NALEMP, in fiscal year 20. Is the amount sufficient to fund outstanding and planned remediation requests to your knowledge?
Congresswoman, the answer is yes. That is what we have since, I think, 1996 requested. In addition, though, we go through this process that's an annual process. What we have put forward is a legislative proposal to institutionalize this rather than going on an annual biannual basis. It's tremendously important, and what we hope to do is see support for institutionalizing this in a broader sense because of the importance of the program.
Thank you. And the Native American Management System, still to you, Mr. McMahon, the Native American Management System for Environmental Impacts, NAMSE, tracks and maintains information on over 900 potential impacts to tribal lands and resources resulting from DoD activities. And there's a series of questions. Do you select the NALEM eligible sites from this list?
Congresswoman, quite frankly, I'm beyond my knowledge on this. What I would like to take is all those questions for record and make sure that we provide you a clear answer with my experts.
Absolutely. So I have two more questions along those lines, so I'll submit these to the record. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
The second question is, when developing MILCON projects, at what point in the process do you investigate whether a given project may impact Indian tribes? And at what point do you engage in tribal consultation? It's an important thing, of course. So.
And each of those, if I could take them for the record and explain clearly where we are in that process.
Okay, that's great. Yes, so I will submit those questions, and I will yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Holland. We're going to do a second round of questions here. I will start that, and then Mr. Lamborn will. Without objection, the committee will welcome Mr. Lamborn to the hearing, and I understand he has a. Well, Mr. Lamborn, I'm glad you showed up, but Mr. Langevin is here. Welcome him to the committee.
Lamborn and I get that all the time. So. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for allowing me to sit in and ask questions, and appreciate the testimony of the panel and the work you're doing. Let me start with this. The FY18 NDAA required that the department describe what future-focused mitigations are needed to ensure mission resiliency and what resources will be required to implement them. This is in particular focus on the issue of climate change and building resiliency. Unfortunately, the department has failed, in my view, to meet its statutory mandate, and I'm concerned that the investments that we're making today go to waste if they do not factor in changes in the climate. The lack of forethought, I believe, is not only fiscally irresponsible, but it also places our service members in readiness at risk. So to all of our witnesses, for this first question, I'd ask just a simple yes or no. Do you agree that the changing climate poses a threat to our readiness? I'll start, and I want to go right down the panel. It's a yes or no question.
Congressman, the answer is we acknowledge that weather is and climate are an impact on national security.
Thank you.
Army agrees.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. So as a follow-up, I want to ask what investments you're making in the FY20 budget in order to mitigate risks that we're going to face in the short, medium, and the long term to our CONUS and OCONUS installations.
Sir, on behalf of the Army, one significant thing that we're already doing is launching installation, energy and water assessment plans at most of our major installations, starting with the most important. We hope to have 22 completed by the end of this fiscal year, meaning 4 months from now. And as part of the assessment, they will factor in things such as extreme weather, climate, and other considerations as to how the installation shapes up as far as judging its resiliency in energy and water, where it's strong, where it's weak, and what are the corrective actions that would be needed to be taken. And so we should have those results fairly soon, obviously after these plans are completed, and be happy to share the combined results with the committee.
Thank you. We welcome that.
Yeah, from a Department of the Navy perspective, very similarly, we're launching what we're calling an optimization and modernization strategy. And that's really to look across the board, both at optimization on a base. So if you think about the devastation in Lejeune, we're reevaluating the rebuild and where those rebuild are actually going to occur, physically relocating some of those facilities from where they used to be located on the base to a different portion that is much more secure from environmental effects. Additionally, as we walk through our modernization, we're including in that resiliency, not just from a climate, energy, water perspective, but resiliency from a cyber perspective. So all of that is being wrapped in as we look installation by installation. We overlay those MILCON projects and those modernization projects that are part of the budget, and we're ensuring as part of the design and build process, we're incorporating those right characteristics into the fundamental design.
Thank you.
The Air Force philosophy is essentially the same as the Navy, which basically is we incorporate those resiliency attributes into our projects through our FSRM funding. As we modernize or upgrade a facility, we bring it up to current code. As we have the opportunity, for instance, at Tyndall Air Force Base or Offutt Air Force Base, where we can raise the flood elevation for where we put facilities, or where we could take a damaged or destroyed facility and relocate that out of the floodplain or an inundation zone, we're certainly taking a look at that. We're also putting more resilient attributes into our new buildings and for the stuff that we're repairing. So for any facilities that get rebuilt at Offutt Air Force Base, if it's still in a kind of a flood zone area, we would use materials that are resistant to that. The same way at Tyndall Air Force Base, we would build the ability to resist the weather or whatever the threats happen to be. We do this through our FSRM program, and the biggest thing the Air Force is doing for that is getting the funding available to do that. The funding we've requested for the last 6 or 7 years has essentially been funding on triage mode. We're just taking a worst first approach where the funding only goes to the most mission critical facilities that are in the worst shape. And when we're talking about resiliency, that takes a long-term proactive look and proactive investments at our facilities. And so we've changed our entire investment strategy this year, and I would ask Congress's help in that. Essentially, we've taken a way to, we've instituted a new strategy to invest proactively in our facilities. It'll require a 2% funding level of our plant replacement value, and it results in a $2 billion increase overall in the infrastructure portfolio for the Air Force. That allows us to invest in facilities at the lowest cost point in the life cycle of the facility and make proactive investments so we can get ahead of the backlog. And so we're not spending 5 to 7 times the amount it takes to build a facility that's failed when we could fix it earlier in the life cycle at quite a bit less than that, just because we're proactive and we can get ahead of it. So you'll see that in our budget request this year, sir.
I know my time's expired. I'm encouraged to hear that, because otherwise we're doing the taxpayers a disservice if we're not thinking about these things and spending taxpayer dollars wisely, planning ahead, and not just pouring good money after bad. So,
And Congressman, from an OSD perspective across the enterprise, it's integral for us to look at resiliency, not just in one category or another at a time, but looking at it holistically. As you heard, cyber plays an integral role. Water plays an integral role in that, in an energy, in addition to climate and weather. And what we're trying to take is a more holistic look at how we build and how we spend our dollars.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Langevin, thank you for joining us, and thank you for making this issue relevant over the last couple of years, and particularly in the last NDAA.
Thank you.
And so we're going to carry on with this. A couple of things, there's some excellent examples of failure to maintain. Camp Lejeune being one. If those roofs had been maintained over the last 40 years, upgraded sometime over the last 40 or 50 years, the loss and damage would have been substantially less. The other thing, and this was in the written testimony, I'm going to just bring it up quickly here, and that is the standard to which we are building projects in the future. I know, Mr. McCone, in your testimony, you spoke to this. I want specific information about what upgrades in the standards that the military is using for construction. This everything from wind to water damage, roofs, all of those kinds of things, energy resiliency, and cyber. So we're not going to go into the specifics today, but each of you raised this question, probably because we asked it. Not probably, but because we asked it. And we want to see the specifics. And so we'll come back for the record, the specific standards that are going to be used. With regard to the facilities that were severely damaged this last year, flooding at Offutt, Camp Lejeune and Tyndall, and other places, the design plans for rebuilding are going to be under very intense review by the committee. As to the standard, as to the relocations, as to the question of moving facilities perhaps somewhere else and not having them at that base at all in the future. So we'll review that in detail. Some of this has been made available to the professional staff. They are reviewing it. They will go into it in far more detail, as will the members of the committee, all of us whom share a common interest in it. I do want to raise one more point before I pass this on to Mr. Wilson. Mr. Lamborn having passed the opportunity for a second round, although he may get engaged yet again. And that has to do with a recurring question that has occurred in my district in California, and that has to do with both MILCON projects and FSRM projects in which local contractors are not employed, but rather national contractors, and in many cases, very few, if any, local subcontractors. This is an ongoing issue. I don't expect a response now. I want all 4 of you to be aware that this is an issue that I am concerned in. Was concerned 6 years ago when we tried to put a 60-mile radius around all bases, requiring that I think 40% be local contractors in that area. That didn't work out, I think, because maybe it was one of the bases. 60 miles would not get you outside the base. So in any case, I'm going to come back at this over and over again. It also relates to hours, working conditions, the state laws, and and what appears to be the avoidance of state laws by national contractors, some of whom call their subcontractors their employees, excuse me, some of whom call their employees subcontractors rather than employees, an ongoing issue that I first dealt with in the 1990s as insurance commissioner in workers' compensation. So we're going to come back at this again, so heads up. With that, I will pass this off to Mr. Wilson.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. McMahon, one final question. The European Defense Initiative is critical to allowing for a faster response to the event of any aggression against the territory of our NATO allies. What are the top military construction projects for the European Deterrence Initiative in the budget, and how does this compare to projects and funding from our partners?
Congressman, I do not have the list in front of me exactly where we are. It continues to be an integral part. I, in fact, leave for UCOM on Friday to look personally at some of the construction, but I will take that for the record and come back to you and show you that.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Crow, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just picking up on the topic of energy resiliency and microgrids. Just curious, I know each of the services are doing a variety of initiatives and things, but we're only going to be as strong as our weakest link, and in some cases that could be the local communities, where a large percentage of our service members actually live and spend a lot of their time. So what's being done between the three different services and Mr. McMahon as well to make sure we're integrating with those local communities, sharing best practices and providing resources and tying in our resiliency plans with their resiliency plans as well?
If I could start, Congressman, and Mr. Beeler referred to one of the activities that we have ongoing, which is where we literally pull the plug on the installation. Obviously, there's a very local impact from that, but what happens is the lessons learned that come out of that activity then are shared not only across that service, but across services, and we've funded it now at this point 5 different exercises, 3 tabletops to be able to share that kind of information, to be able to not only educate the leadership, but more importantly, drive behaviors as we move forward with modifying our installations and trying to enhance that energy resilience.
And on behalf of the Army, I'll just state that certainly with Fort Bragg, the community was definitely very much drawn in, and they will be a part of the review process and certainly be kept every step of the way. And in a whole host of areas, not just this, and the major bases interact with the local governance extremely well on an ongoing basis. And so this will be just one more aspect that will further cement a well-coordinated effort.
I guess just to clarify the question for Mr. Mellon and Mr. Henderson, since we're running low on time here, I guess I'm speaking less to the issue of whether we're sharing lessons learned from the base tests itself, as much as are we working with and providing resources and help to local communities so they develop their own resiliency plans and conduct tests as well, so that they're prepared?
So from a Department of the Navy perspective, I'll try and answer that in 2 parts. One, as we look at modernization and resiliency for each one of our sites, part of that dialogue is with the local providers, whether it's utilities, water, wastewater treatment, whatever it is. And that dialogue is bi-directional in terms of understanding where their risks are, what dependencies we have, what our mitigations might be as we're looking at how we mitigate those risks and provide that resiliency for the base. So there's a bit of a variation depending on how that interaction is and where they're at. Part of it is we also look at how can we best utilize the resources that are available. So in some instances where we need to make improvements, we look for opportunities to partner with the private sector, provide them that opportunity to meet that service, enter into a longer-term agreement, but not necessarily have to invest Navy dollars in order to do that. And we're doing that in several areas. And if you'd like, I can provide you some of those examples as part of the record.
Just a couple initiatives the Air Force is looking at. As we've more and more started privatizing utilities. Of course, we're intrinsically linked to the public utility providers that provide that. Two big initiatives we're doing. One of them we call the mission threat analysis, and this has to do with identifying where our vulnerabilities are. In other words, if you're flying a remotely piloted aircraft and your cockpit's in Hawaii or somewhere in the Midwest, you might have 2 or 3 relay stations to get to a command center that's tracking that overseas in Germany or the Middle East, and then another link to get into the people launching and recovering the actual aircraft. If at any point along there, it's not just the energy resiliency at that base, but if any point there we lose power or we have some type of an impact or some threat impact, we have to know how to make all those nodes resilient along the way. So understanding the vulnerabilities, and then once we do that, we're getting after, one of the initiatives we're looking at was energy as a service to the base, but now looking at energy resilience as a service. So in other words, writing those resiliency requirements into our privatized contracts with the people who are providing that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Lockton.
Sure. Mr. McMahon, I'm just going to go back to the climate change report that you all turned in January. And the report, I was an assistant secretary at the Pentagon where we helped write the first report that was done under, at that point, a man named John Conyers, and on just sort of starting to think about how climate would impact facilities, bases, ranges, but also deployment of forces if there's more conflict, the melting of the Arctic, et cetera. So prior Congress issued this requirement for report, and you provided it, but it really didn't take us anywhere further than the original report that we did back in 2014. And I'm just wondering, in particular, there's 2 areas where you didn't answer the questions. Number one, you were supposed to provide the top 10 most vulnerable locations, or I guess bases in the world, most vulnerable to climate change. And then more importantly to me, just for readiness, the cost estimates to mitigate the risks to those bases. And I'm just wondering if there was a reason why you didn't answer those questions in the report.
Congresswoman, when we did the report, and with your background, you recognize that not all bases are created equal. And so the example that I use is that if we'd picked a rehab or an R&R installation, for example, in Hawaii, that may be facing climate change or impacts from weather, it does not raise to the same level of concern as perhaps one of the installations that we listed. And so what we tried to do was focus specifically on those most critical installations in the Department of Defense, and those came off of our 79 mission assurance installations selected because of the importance of that. And in a closed environment, I'd be happy to share with you why each of those installations was on the list. But with that, what we did then is provide what we assumed to be our assessment of what the threat was based upon the 5 categories that the Congress gave us to consider for that. And as you know, those 5 categories, neither Tyndall nor Camp Lejeune would have been covered. And so with that, what I would like us to be able to do in the future is attack this holistically. That's from an enterprise perspective as we talk about resilience, looking not only at climate and weather, but the other categories that I alluded to previously, to be able to talk about this in a way that we can paint a more effective picture and ensure that we've got the funding necessary to get to where we need to be.
Yeah, I think we would all welcome that. I think, including during my time at the Pentagon, starting this conversation was a little bit like pulling teeth. And if you have a more comprehensive way to look at it or a more thoughtful way to look at it, I have no doubt that there's a better way than DoD tasking a report, but I think we would welcome that. I would say my understanding, just living in the Army as an Army wife and now as an Army stepmom, just prudent planning for possible scenarios is what we do, right? And without the political piece of it, and I don't think we need more relevant examples than what's been going on in the past year with some of our bases. So your help getting out of what feels like pulling teeth and into a real affirmative, positive posture where, hey, this is just contingency planning like I do with any other potential factor, I think it would go a long way to making us feel like you are taking this seriously, and not because we keep asking you to, but because I actually believe it to be a factor that affects our operations.
I think, and I'll speak for the services as well as OSD, I think all of us recognize that, for example, sea levels rising. Quite frankly, I'm not worried about what the causal factors of those are. I have to ensure, along with my partners up here, that we're taking prudent action to make sure that we're preparing for whatever that threat might be. And I think we've seen some tools of recent that I'd like to share with the Congress offline that said we think we can do a better job of planning in the future and providing a more holistic picture as we look at resiliency for installations.
I think that would be great because I'm not stuck on the politics. I just want to know we're doing the prudent planning. So I appreciate that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Latkin. The principle of the 5 Ps, I suppose, is at play here. Also, during the course of the testimony, all 3 or 4 of you witnesses have discussed the issue of risk assessment for each installation, and that I take that risk assessment to be all potential risks that are at that that could occur at that particular facility. Maybe a typhoon, hurricane, tornado, whatever it might be. And so we're going to pursue that, and as we look at MILCON going forward, we're going to deal with that issue, and which means you're going to get to deal with it too, and come to us with specific ideas about how to deal with those risks. Mr. Langevin, I believe you have another round of questions.
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to go back, Mr. McMahon, just a little more specifically on Ms. Sotkin's question. I'm glad she raised it in the way that she did. I wrote that language requiring the assessment, the top 10 most vulnerable military bases, as well as the costs to be associated. And I appreciate what you have to say, Mr. McMahon, about taking a holistic look, and that I applaud and I support that effort. It doesn't excuse the department, though, from fulfilling the requirement in the law that was the way the language was written. And we are going back to the department and asking again for a redo and to list the top 10 most vulnerable military bases to climate change specifically. Again, I applaud the holistic look and other challenges, but we need to know about the issues specific as it relates to climate change, and then the costs associated with dealing with those effects. And the report did not confine the department to just looking at CONUS, but to looking at OCONUS as well. And so the department completely missed the mark on that. You looked at CONUS, but you didn't include in the report looking at it again holistically but as it relates specifically to climate change, looking at worldwide. So we are going back to you on that, and I would appreciate hopefully we can get the answers to the questions that the way that we've asked in the way we've asked them. So as a follow-up, though, I do want to ask, how are you evaluating those risks as they evolve? What modeling is the department using to evaluate the costs, to mitigate the risks, and how are you prioritizing the climate mitigation efforts within your budgets? And just in case my time doesn't run out, in another related, unrelated topic, but related to the topic at hand, the department's first ever comprehensive audit identified insufficient controls to ensure the accuracy and completeness of general property, plant, and equipment, the second largest category of assets on the DoD balance sheet. The auditors found instances in which facilities had been physically demolished but remained on the property records, and the reverse, where they found facilities that physically existed but were not on the property records. So there are wasteful costs associated with these inaccuracies, and what are each of you doing to clean up the real property inventory processes and improve internal controls related to general PP&E? So,
Congressman, to that question, beginning with the Acting Deputy Secretary of Defense on down, on a continuous battle rhythm of being able to look at the the direction for each of the services of going out and doing 100% inventory, doing book-to-floor, floor-to-book assessment of where we are in terms of the audit. We acknowledge, as the Deputy Secretary has a number of times, that our books were not where they needed to be. And so we have taken a enterprise approach at the department level with each of the services, with undersecretaries from each of the services sitting in the room, and ensuring between them, the comptroller, and the CFOs that we are doing this. And the intent is to have this accomplished by the end of the fiscal year with regards to this specific question.
Thank you. And then the other, on the modeling, and can we talk about that as well?
Congressman, I was a little quick in my first answer to have gotten to this point that I was kind of hoping to miss the modeling question. I will tell you that we need to do a better job. I will tell you that, at least from my perspective, that the Corps of Engineers has demonstrated some capabilities that we've not holistically used in the department. To the previous question that I was asked, I think there are some things that we can do better than we've done in the past in being able to articulate what those costs are. We do take it seriously, we acknowledge it, and we understand that there's an impact on many of our installations because of climate, and it does affect our national security. So our intent was not to demean or ignore the Congress with our first report. It came out of my office, quite frankly, so you're talking to the right person. Our job is to ensure, though, that we communicate to you what we see the risks, and if asked again, I think we would take a different approach a year from now, utilizing some better tools to be able to do that assessment.
Thank you, Mr. McMahon. I appreciate that. Hopefully when the department does the redo, we'll get it, the report in the way that we required it. Thankfully, the people have reelected me for at least another 2 years. I hope more than that, but I'll be around for a while, and I'm not going away, and I hope we can work together on this and get the answers we need. I appreciate it.
Congressman, I hope we can as well, and I hope we together can take a holistic approach to this question of resilience.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you for holding this important hearing, the work that you're doing, whether it's on the climate change issue or resiliency as a whole, and as it relates to many other topics. I appreciate your leadership, and again, appreciate you allowing me to sit in on this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for making this an issue in the last NDAA. It's certainly going to be an ongoing issue here. I would just add that you know, nature has a way of also prioritizing. We have 3 examples here of Camp Lejeune, Tyndall, and Offutt, in which all three were not on the list, but here we are, about $8 to $10 billion worth of problem going forward. I've got one more thing, Mr. Langevin Lambert. You've got anything else that you want to ask?
My questions have been asked and answered.
Good. I've got one more thing, and that is an ongoing question. There was a near unanimous vote of both the House and the Senate to reject the emergency declaration that the President made. He, of course, vetoed that and then went on to request that somewhere between $7, $8, maybe $9 billion of MILCON projects be diverted from military construction to border wall and other things along the border. And this is a question for Mr. McMahon. Have the projects that are let me put this in a different way. Have you identified, has there been any specificity in the identification of projects that are not going to be funded in this cycle as a result of the President's request?
Congress, or Mr. Chairman, as you're aware, guidance was provided by the Secretary, the Acting Secretary, to the Comptroller on moving forward with beginning to put together a list potentially if, in fact, the 2808 authorities were going to be used. That letter was signed, I think, on the 12th of April with a date of 10 May of when the answer had to be back. Concurrent with that, the Acting Secretary asked for an assessment done by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Where we are today is that there are roughly of the original list that was provided to the Congress, there's roughly $4.3 billion worth of projects to potentially cover $3.6 billion worth of projects. So we have, with certain criteria, skinnied that down, not included any projects that would be projected to be awarded in fiscal year 2019. In addition, any projects that were specifically focused on either housing or barracks and dormitories. Where we are today is that list from each of the services is being collected at the OSD comptroller level. There is no specific list done today, as of today, with a date of 10 May, of being able to finalize that list to go back and meet the acting secretary's position should he elect to utilize the 2808 authorities.
So 9 days from today, there will be a list of projects that are vulnerable to the 2808 request. Is that correct?
That list, yes, sir. That my math is the same as yours. That would be it. Yes, sir.
And the amount of projects that are, the total value of the projects that are to be identified is how much?
We've identified potential, if in fact the authorities are used, is $3.6 billion that the president has identified that potentially could come from 2808 authorities. There are, when you look at the sum total with the criteria that we've made public, that is approximately $4.3 billion worth. So a net difference between what we need and what's available of about $700 million.
I think the use of the word "we need" is exactly what's in contention here. Do we need to do the military projects, the military construction projects, or do we need to do the border wall issue? I don't think, well, I do believe it's necessary to tell you how important this question is, not only to the military with regard to its ongoing needs for military construction, which apparently in the past the military thought were essential, and the Congress agreed. Therefore, those projects were put into the MILCON budget. The second question is that it is not at all clear that those projects will be refunded in the future years. And also, there are many of us who really believe that the Constitution was written in such a way as to say that only Congress can appropriate money. So I'll let it go at that. Be aware that this is a very real and profoundly important question to me, and I believe to many other members of Congress. This issue will go long, long beyond this Congress. Should the president be allowed to literally appropriate money using an emergency declaration? It's a profoundly important question of the division of power and the role of Congress and the role of the president. And so it's not going to be a one and done issue. So I'll let that lie where it is. And with that, I want to thank the members, the witnesses, for your testimony today. It was most helpful and fulsome. Also, your written statements cover most of the issues we have. I do want to alert you that we will be going back on the issue of sustainment, which we did not cover today. In some ways, you did cover that in your written testimony, but we need to get into that in great detail, and we will do so in future hearings. With that, the meeting is adjourned.